Welcome to this November 30th, 2017 episode of the Poetry of Predicament podcast. Today we're very excited to replay an episode from a Symposium 2016 that was produced by Carolyn Baker and Dean Walker back called the Active Love Symposium. One of our most popular guests, Lise Van Susteren, who's herself a prominent psychotherapist and also environmental activist and thought leader with regard to providing resilience training nationwide and worldwide in the face of our coming collapse of systems and so on. Hope you enjoy this remarkable conversation with a remarkable thought leader, Lise Van Susteren.
Starting to wonder if time is so short that it's almost pointless to write books.
If we could say it's 2030 or 2020 or 2040, it's right now.
Just because of the increase in temperature, that we will see a 30 to 40% decrease in global food production capacity by the end of the century.
More social unrest, more refugees, the refugee crisis that we have seen, particularly to begin with, coming out of Syria and the Middle East generally, but we can expect more of the same.
Wherever we look, there are these extraordinary changes, and they're happening faster, I think, than we're really able as humans to begin to assimilate and really understand.
Climate chaos. We can't avoid climate chaos. There's going to be increasing storms, bigger storms, desertification, shifts in growing belts and habitability. That's inevitable.
There's just way too many variables. There's so much we don't know.
Kindness is still existent within this time of crisis.
So we're all coming in from different time zones and from different experiences today. So I'd like us to take a couple of minutes to get centered. And this is really important because one of the most important things we need right now is to slow down. Our lives are speeding up and events are speeding up so quickly and becoming more intense. So to deal with that and to stabilize ourselves with that, we need to slow down. So let's take a couple of minutes to really slow down. And the best way to do that is to take a couple of really deep breaths, slowly, as deep as you can. Hold it for a bit, and then slowly release. Let's take another slow, deep breath. Holding it for a couple of seconds. And then slowly, slowly releasing. Releasing as far out as you can. Most of us don't know how to breathe in this culture. Most of us rarely breathe in this culture. And when you're really breathing and focusing on your breathing, you're not thinking. Deep breathing is a wonderful cure for getting lost in your head. So let's take another long, slow, deep breath and feel every part of it. Feel that breath coming into your body, that air coming in slowly, filling your lungs, holding it for a couple of seconds, and slowly, slowly letting it out. really feeling what that's like and how different that is from your normal, regular, daily routine. And notice what that does to your body and to your mind. Allow yourself to become really present as you breathe. Really get here. And we're going to do this just one more time. Very long, slow, deep breath. Filling your lungs slowly with air. All the way in. Holding it a couple of seconds. Letting it all out slowly, as far out as you can. And feeling your body. Feeling the difference that makes. And so it is. And I'm so glad that each of you is here tonight. We have a very special presenter this evening. Dr. Lise Van Susteren, MD from Washington, D.C., author of The Psychological Effects of Global Warming, an activist in her community and around the world to help us respond to, emotionally and spiritually, our climate predicament. So we're going to begin by playing the recorded interview that I did a few months ago with Lisa, and then she is going to join us.
It's imperative. If it's an emergency, we better have evidence to support the fact, and we do. And that's why it's so important that we all collectively take action. So I get annoyed with people who want to sugarcoat things too, or want to infantilize. This is something we gave up years ago in the medical field. We stopped pretending to patients that they didn't have cancer or bad disease, lest they be upset, because we needed them to be involved in the decision making so that they could make informed consent decisions. Right. So, this is, you and I agree. I have to say, I'm absolutely blown away at the incisiveness with which so many people are looking at this problem that I never knew about before. I've been living in this bubble here, lucky me, in Washington, where a lot of the hot air is contributing to our problems, as you well know.
Right.
And I'm just so in awe, really, of the perceptive capacity of people like Carolyn and Andrew Hartley and Guy McPherson, and how the sense of the beauty of the spirit that experiences this so almost surgically is something that I'm just in awe about, because it's been a certain kind of blurred awakening that is happening to me. And here I discover all of you.
Speaking today with Dr. Lise Van Susteren, the author of a magnificent paper entitled The Psychological Effects of Global Warming on the United States, and Why the U.S. Mental Health Care System is Not Adequately Prepared, which anyone can read online. And so, Lisa, thank you so much for being with us today.
Well, thank you. I am really very grateful to be with you and to connect with my kindred spirits.
And it's delightful to have you in this symposium, because your work is really at the crux of what this symposium is all about. So I'm going to ask you some questions, and each question has a context, and I'll introduce the context before I actually ask you the question. The first context is that, of course, in this symposium, we're asserting that we have to have at least a minimal awareness of imminent, abrupt climate change and systems collapse impacts if we're going to be responsible human beings on the planet at this time. We're also very concerned that the projections of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, their projection of 1.5 C to 2 C rise in temperature by 2100 are conservative to the point of being fraudulent. And so in that context, I'd like to ask you, first of all, specifically, what impacts of abrupt climate change and systems collapse do you predict will impact your immediate community, your region, and of course the world?
Locally, I'm from the Northeast, and we can look at these last couple of weeks and know that this place has just been scorchingly hot. And people have died. People, especially, this is an environmental justice aspect, is that a lot of people don't have the means to have fancy air conditioning so that they don't get exposed to these kinds of heat stressors. But it's also things that we can't so readily see or count, and that is that when you've got hotter temperatures, you've got more polluted air. And when you have more polluted air, that means you have respiratory illnesses. That means that you create long-term health impacts, that reduced lung volume in kids, cancers, other respiratory disorders. We know that the cardiovascular effects of polluted air with heat. This is a very polluted region from a polluted air region. We have bad air quality here at times in the Baltimore, Washington, D.C. area. And then from a mental health perspective, and this is something that's come out of Canada, and I hope we'll be seeing more and more research on, is the ER physicians know that on these bad air quality days, the number of people showing up with anxiety disorders, threats to commit suicide, rises quite dramatically. There's a statistical significance. Well, that's not negligible. Who's going to pay for all this? Who's going to take care of all these people? Not to mention the fact that this is a fundamental human rights violation.
Absolutely.
All right, so that's just heat, okay? And not to get too long-winded, but we also live in this beautiful area, which is the Chesapeake Bay. And this watershed is being polluted and is polluted. And it's from hot temperature also because we have algal blooms here. Because of all the fertilizer, we have dead zones. This is a huge tourism area. Lots of water being drunk around here. And this is something which does not get cleaned up overnight. And we have sought through various governments here to get the tri-state area, Pennsylvania, Delaware, well, not just the tri-state, but the watershed area, Pennsylvania, Delaware, DC, Maryland, Virginia, to work together. But there's still many failing grades here that are affecting also fishing industry. That's a lot of jobs. That's a lot of people being affected. Then we have sea level rise. And I urge anyone who's listening to go and look, try to dig up. The Washingtonian did an expose not so very long ago showing how frequently we can expect the District of Columbia to be flooded with sea level rise from storm surge and, of course, just straight from sea level rise. So this is just, a thimbleful of impacts because these are all direct hits. But then, of course, we have all of the empathic identification with people who are around us. We're sentient. We feel bad when other people are suffering. So this is just what we can count. But I'm going to stop talking so that you don't have to just hear me on a dialogue or on a soapbox. I'll defer to you now. I know you want to talk about world impacts, and I'm happy to do that at your urging.
Well, yeah, and I love it when you get on the soapbox because we really need to hear a physician's perspective here. Intuitive-wise or scientific research-wise, do you have any sense of when these impacts will become critical, like 2020, 2030, 2040, whatever?
Yeah, wouldn't that be nice if we could say it's 2030 or 2020 or 2040? It's right now.
Yes.
We're doing everything right now. It's just a question of how much worse it's going to get. We're seeing a collapse of our fisheries in oceans all over the world, with acidification that's coming from increased CO2, with rising temperatures, certainly with overfishing. But this is for God's sake, I mean, are oceans collapsing? Where are people going to get protein? What are they going to, eat? Maybe some of the rich or entitled people of the world may be able to survive, but what about the rest of the world? So we are seeing that the oceans are in many places collapsing. That is what I'm hearing, at least. I'm not an oceanographer, but I read this and I read it from reputable places. We certainly know that wildlife has declined, I think, by half in the last several decades. Well, I mean, that's our ecosystem. What are we going to do when the main pillar of our ecosystem is dramatically turned upside down? Birds, insects, large animals. I mean, the whole bit. Even simultaneously as population is now on the rise. Do the math. Who's going to support our agricultural, who's going to support our food system is what I'm trying to say. And we won't even get into the pesticides and carcinogens that we're spraying as a doctor that I would like to get into, but won't. But those are, okay, so our oceans, our food, energy, the availability of fossil fuels is still very much a part of our lives, with industry seeking offshore drilling and extreme extraction methods to get ever more fossil fuels out of the ground or oceans when we have alternatives. Why are we not building infrastructure for renewable energy? And I got to tell you, Carolyn, we're down a group of us and everybody can salute us for this, but we're kind of unsung whatevers on this. We're down to the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission right here in Washington, D.C., and we understand that by living here, we do have a certain responsibility. We are there. They rubber stamp all these fossil fuel infrastructures that assure that we're going to be using bad energy for years to come. And they rubber stamp these things. Well, we're there interrupting the meetings, infiltrating the meetings, stopping them and holding up our banners and saying, how could you? So these are just three aspects that particularly come to mind, not to mention the health issues, the psychological issues, and the fact that we now have created a whole demographic that are climate refugees with failed political states.
Yes.
So there you have it. If that isn't enough to feel in a bad mood, we'll talk about solutions and good stuff later. But I mean, this is reality. We got to connect these dots.
We absolutely do. And I want to get into a little bit more now on the psychological point of view. With another context, before I ask you the questions, we're seeing a lot of indicators of abrupt climate change and systems collapse accelerating. We've seen it even in the first half of this year, and you've said very clearly that we are in it now. This is not a future thing. So from the rapid reduction of Arctic ice to ever-increasing violence all over the world to innumerable examples of the undealt with human shadow playing out, we're seeing severe warning signs of imminent collapse of systems, both natural and constructed, and the intensifying acceleration of abrupt climate change. So you've already given us some of the warning signs and indicators that you're concerned about, from the very close to home to the global. So I'd like to go ahead and just ask you, what emotions or charged reactions have you experienced as you've considered those warning signs that you see all around you?
Boy, well, let me just add, you're right. I didn't even speak about sea level rise. We're going to get 10 feet. For sure, from the most reputable scientists I talked to. And John Holdren, who is Obama's chief science advisor, said maybe as many as 15 feet. And that's in decades to come. This is not hundreds of years from now. So
Right.
What are our emotions? Well, they're what you would expect of someone seeing people and places and creatures that you love in imminent danger. I'm frantic. I'm fearful. I'm depressed. I'm a little paralyzed sometimes, not much because I'm surrounded by people who are ready to hit the streets all the time or hit Capitol Hill. But this is really devastating. And it's a newsflash. Civilization as we know it may end and we may not survive. It's upsetting. But this is a constant in my life. It drips into my life night and day. And I have to admit that it also seeps into my sleep. I awaken and I don't see that this is pathological. I see this as a realistic response. What I see as pathological is the indifference or the belief unsubstantiated that some technological cowboy solution is going to come in and fix this.
Right.
That's not reasonable. And as a psychiatrist, one of the things that I have done every day, and that's why I wanted to become a psychiatrist, was to try to warn people of danger. And in an effort to have them address it now while they could still do something. And to break down the denial that is really a defense against knowing the truth. So,
which then leads me,
here I am, right in this.
which leads me to the next question, which, I hadn't thought that I would ask you, but I do want to ask you, what are you seeing consciously or unconsciously with your patients? How do you see this manifesting?
Okay, two things. One is more and more. I've gotten now patients who come in who have chosen me as a psychiatrist because they have seen that I'm concerned about climate change. And then let me state also that I'm going to try working with a group that has statisticians so that we can begin to draw up some kind of a questionnaire, and understanding that self-reporting is not always very accurate. I would like to have a little bit of an understanding in a nuanced approach what people who come into my office are likely to say. Now, one thing that I also know from years of experience is that anxiety is like a big black pool in our brains, drains from many different sources, and we don't always know the names of the sources. So sometimes you may think that you're coming in because you're anxious about money, or you're anxious about the health of a spouse, and those are all legitimate concerns, but it's all embedded in a matrix of being fearful that the entire world is collapsing. And, when we were little kids, we would walk into the house. We knew when mom was mad. She didn't have to tell us.
Right.
We feel that cold, stiff sort of feeling in her back to us. And we knew, whoa, we better steer clear here. I don't have the slightest shred of a doubt that every one of us, never mind the 200 million, the whole bloody country, and everybody else on some level recognizes that Mother Nature is fed up with us. And there are going to be consequences. So I believe that everyone on some level has deep anxiety, whether they know it or not, and whether they admit it or not, about what we're doing to nature and specifically what's happening with our climate.
Well, I couldn't agree more, and thank you for that, Lisa. Another context to lay out before I ask the next questions, even those of us that have been engaged in abrupt climate change and systems collapse conversations for years are seeing that the coming global waves of toxic stress are going to require all of our inner capabilities and resources. And so in this symposium, we're asserting that all of us will need to up our skill set regarding how to connect with other people at every level, from our own inner circle to neighbors, to people who think and act very differently from us. We need to become good at having what Dean Walker calls the impossible conversation. We're all going to need to have some sort of tribe or inner circle. We're all going to need to be able to connect in some way with others in our general communities. And especially in stressful times. So I'm wondering, first of all, what do you consider to be the critically important inner capabilities or tools for the collapse-aware person who hopes to face this predicament and these challenges with maximum presence and an open heart?
First of all, I really, really appreciate that phrase, the impossible conversations. I very much identify with it. And I can speak from personal experience about my own challenge in going from what I was trained to do, which was to kind of point out problems and to warn people, which is what I've done as a psychiatrist about what's going to happen with their behaviors, making suggestions about what they were supposed to do, but offering them the opportunity to understand, laying out the problems, but very much expecting that they will then pick up the lead or the reins and go with it. And most of the people who come into therapy are people like that, who once you unearth their problems, you know, they've got the resolve and the resilience to go forward. But the transition for me in this work was to go from being a person who was warning and talking about the problems and trying to point out how we had to connect the dots to now a new place, which requires that I actively seek to make solutions available to the people that I can influence. Either upstream, naturally, you know, discussions like this and at meetings and things like that, but also right here on the ground with, as you said, family and neighbors. And I've just come to kind of that realization. I was so frantically involved in other activities, political and activist, etc., that this knowledge that how much can take place when we meet with the people who trust us, who love us, who are involved with us, can benefit. And specifically, what I plan to do is have that conversation with my family members, have the conversation with neighbors, and look at the solutions that we know are there and that we can engage in and embrace with not only, and specifically, I'm going to decline that, obviously. Sorry about that. And that is specifically start talking to people about how to reduce their emissions. And it would be in a new kind of effort that allows people to calculate what they're emitting, and then making a voluntary contribution to offset it. And I'm going to approach my family, and I'm going to approach my friends, and I'm going to approach my neighbors with this, not only because I believe that if they voluntarily offset, they can contribute money to good groups, and we can decide what groups those are, but it gets people finally to do two things. One, to realize they do have power. They're not helpless. They can do some things. And that it gives them a deeper understanding of what the impact of their choices are having. Right. And with that in mind, one last thing, I'm making a bid, maybe there's some graphic artists out there, but we talk about tons of carbon that we emit, and no matter how many times I read it, I can never remember if it's whatever it is. And I would not say what my number is, but we need to look at this more from an imagery perspective so that we can think to ourselves, how many planet person am I? Am I a one planet person where it only takes one planet for the amount of resources that I use up, or many more? And we need to start thinking of ourselves as 1, 2, 3, or whatever number planet people we are, so we can get a graphic understanding of what we're doing, because we're hiding it from ourselves. Especially people who have the capacity to buy more, to travel more, to eat what they want, etc. These carbon emissions must be brought home. Now, home, literally. Friends, family, neighbors, coworkers.
Well, you know, in so many cases, and this is the reason Dean wrote his book, The Impossible Conversation, it's not possible, or at least it's very difficult, to talk with some of our family members and friends because they don't want to go there. And I suspect until the halls of Congress are sloshing with water, it may continue to be almost impossible. But I'm wondering if you have any theories about why our culture is just not talking about what we're calling the sober data, or the obvious collapse of our climate, ecological, and human systems.
Okay. Well, I certainly do have thoughts about that. And one of them is, if you look at climate, it really is a kind of a metaphor for aging and for our eventual death.
Right.
So there's inexorable change occurring, and it's going in a bad direction. And so when you talk about climate, people really want to repress that. There's no place in our culture to talk about aging and death. Our culture celebrates youth and productivity, and we are trained by our culture and by our personal experiences to push these things aside, to repress them. So we've got a built-in cultural influences and personal influence to repress this talk. That's number one. Number two, on the other end of the spectrum, very scientifically, neuroscience shows us that we are hardwired, believe it or not, to suppress this or repress this knowledge. In times of stress, what happens is that our brains, if we're resilient and resourceful, they tend to take that stress and literally pass it into another part of our brain where it can be altered or transformed in a more positive direction so that it reduces the stress-reducing section of our brain. And then if that isn't enough just to reduce the stress, it goes a second step towards areas, dopamine centers, which reward us for not feeling the stress. So we are up against hardwiring. We have cultural issues, then we have hardwiring, then we have the fact that a wash in water, but right now it's a wash in dollars. And until we get money out of our political system, we are going to have these people hired by industry to continue to vote and lobby for the very things that are bringing us down.
Yeah, as you're talking, it reminds me of the book that was written by Dr. Per Espen Stoknes in Norway. You may know of him. He's a psychologist who wrote What We Think About When We Don't Want to Think About Global Warming. And he talks about this hard wiring and how really difficult it is for people to hear and really take this in. And also, we live in a very grief-phobic culture and a death-phobic culture. I suspect that in some of the more, the less developed countries, the indigenous cultures, it's easier to talk about this in a real way. But for us here in the United States, we really have barriers.
Oh, you're so right. I'm glad that you said that. You remind me. I lived in Africa and I worked as a doctor in Africa. And I saw the difference in a culture that recognized mortality and illness and that you couldn't control everything. And while obviously there are benefits and downsides to being in a society like that, the sense of connection and the sense of community and taking care of each other and protecting each other was a very intimate activity. And grief was something that we were very open about. But here, people die in these very sterile environments and hospitals with tubes and noises and things that we know can make people psychotic. But yet that's what we do. And we rarely choose nor do we feel comfortable with expressing the realities of our mortality and all of the associated sentiments. And as you say, our grief. People here in our culture very much expect that you will put on a happy face, that can-do-itiveness, that at least superficially feel better even than they shouldn't. So well said.
Yes, indeed. I conduct a lot of grief rituals and grief weekends for people. And, it's based on the African funeral, which I was able to learn about from a couple of African shamans. And when I think about the way folks in West Africa grieve, and I think about the way we deal with funerals, we're extremely well-behaved and civilized. Not so in some of these cultures where grief is a much more intimate process, as you've experienced.
Carolyn, I will remember all my life a woman who came into the hospital in the middle of the night when I was working in Togo, and had the loveliest little boy. He was such a little sweetheart. And the circumstances aren't necessary to recount, but I will never forget that by early morning, just before dawn, that little boy was on her back, dead, wrapped in a cloth. And she was taking off for her village up north with him dead on her back. This is a very different way of experiencing life and death, obviously.
Obviously, yes, that's beautiful. Well, let's talk about resources, inner and outer resources. And I'm wondering what inner and or outer resources you draw on to stay present and open-hearted in challenging or stressful times.
It's kind of cyclical. I'm not a person very steady in terms of how I respond. So it's kind of on a spectrum where I'm out there with my fist in the air, determined we're going to do this, we're going to. We're on the Hill. We had a meeting not long ago, a hearing on Exxon New with a group that I'm active with, Interfaith Moral Action on Climate, and holding people's feet to the fire, talking about what didn't happen and should have happened and how Exxon lied to the public, etc. Okay, so that's one aspect where I'm with my kindred spirits, or we're down at FERC interrupting the meetings. And then there's the times when my throat just tightens. And I can't believe it. But I realize that it's sort of the bias that we have that the world is going to take place the way we have always imagined it. And there's no reason to believe that. And I just took a class which was a great relief on the cosmos. On the one hand, it was a great relief to get away from politics and other things here in the US. But nonetheless, it made me realize, boy, do we have hubris to think that we're going to stand up to physics? And the cosmos will not let us, no matter how many laws we pass. Once we start breaking the laws of physics, that we're not going to be able to stand up to the laws of physics. And so when those thoughts come to me, I'm empty. So when I'm thinking about animals, or I'm thinking about a farmer in India who's seeing his cattle die and he can't feed his family, and we know there's suicides there, my throat just constricts. And then there are times when I'm empty, when I think, we're trying to stand up to physics. How dumb are we? Mm-hmm. And then I've got those angry, we're all together in this moment when I'm out there in the streets. So I, shuffle back and forth on that spectrum, any one place or another, depending.
Well, I want to thank you as we're coming down to the close of our conversation. I want to thank you so much for your honesty, for being in your heart and being present with us. It certainly goes against the stereotype of the physician who's, scientific mind and all of that, and kind of removed. And you are really present with all of this. And I so appreciate your heart and what you're doing in the world to do what you can.
Well, I'm thanking all of you, frankly, and for knowing, and this is the one sort of silver lining to all of this. Gosh, what amazing people I have met, and what incredible experiences with these wonderful people I have had that I never would have known otherwise. So if there's any silver lining, it's this beautiful world of incredible people.
Well, there's a couple of questions that I'm just kind of came up with that are sort of spontaneous. I don't know where you are with music and what kinds of music you like best, but as you think about all this, and as you think about perhaps being introduced to the question and answer period in our symposium, is there a song that comes to mind that you'd like to be introduced with?
There very much is. And it's from a nature lover. And it's a person that many of us whose name most of us will recognize. And that is Antonio Vivaldi. And he was very much, of course, we all know his Four Seasons. And he had music that he composed in keeping with a certain narrative that he wanted to tell. So this, as I think about where we are now, and where it is that we hope to be and the emotions that we're feeling. His Four Seasons of Summer is one that captures some of the themes I think that we are wrestling with, and that is that in the heat of the early moments of the summer, his music is languorous and we're quiet and we're slow, and it reminds me a little bit of our denial.
Yes.
And then as things get rolling, as the movements continue, there's this feverish, frantic, a fearful sound of a storm, a summer storm.
Yes.
And this is something which is very much, I think, in keeping with some of the themes that we're talking about here. So Vivaldi's Summer would very much, if you could wrestle it into position, would be very much something that I would embrace.
Well, I think that would be very easy to do. And one more thing, Lisa, if there were something that you could say to the world right now, what might that be?
Okay, well, I'm glad you asked that because it gives me an opportunity to talk about one of my new friends and someone I never would have met had it not been for the work on climate. And that is, I'll give his name, Reverend Mitch Hescox, who is the founder of the Evangelical Environmental Network.
Mm-hmm.
And Mitch has become a big friend, and without suggesting that I have any religious affiliation with the evangelicals or any religious affiliation at all, I'm spiritual, but I don't have religious affiliation. I just value this relationship with him. And one of the things that he said in his recent book, which is a call for evangelicals to embrace stewardship, is one of the lines that most marked me, and it came at a time, I think, when I felt really low, was it's not hopeless and we're not helpless. So that is something that I'm very grateful to him for saying, and I'm also very grateful for his friendship, which is really emblematic of the number of people that I never would have known before, but who have enriched my life so deeply.
So Lise Van Susteren, this has been absolutely magnificent to talk with you today. And thank you so much for being with us and being so present and in your heart. And I look forward to the question and answer session. And I wish you really the very best with all that you're doing for us in the world.
Well, thank you very much, Carolyn, for this opportunity.
This is the garden outside in Eugene, Oregon. Ivy took these shots, and she has a master gardener sister. So thank you for that, Ivy. And now we're going to open this wonderful time to Lisa. Thank you, Lisa, for being here. I want everyone to know it's a little bit late on the East Coast. So Lisa's being very generous with her time, and we don't want to keep her long, but she's here. And let's open up to some questions for her or comments.
I'll just say hello, everyone, and it's nice to be with you.
Thank you, Lisa.
While people are gathering their thoughts and hopefully a number of questions for you, Lisa, I just wanted to also welcome you and let you know just how thrilled I am that you're a part of this symposium. It's really would be very difficult for me to figure out who else we could have on the roster that has more to say directly about what we want this symposium to be about. And so, just thanks. I also look forward to getting to meet you in person pretty soon, because I'm assuming that you're at the Transformational Resilience Folks Conference coming up in the next month.
The International Transformational Resilience Coalition in Washington, November 3 and 4.
You know, and if you wouldn't mind, maybe that's a good place to start, because I know that in my roughly 2 years now of really diving deeply to vet the information about abrupt climate change, it blew my mind. I couldn't believe that this stuff was real. It sounded wacko to me. So once I came around to realizing, yes, it is vetted, it is for real, in fact, it's accelerating, I then started to look for, so who has something to say about this? Because there's a whole lot of nothing being said and a whole lot of denial and so on, things that get airtime that really don't seem to be addressing what's really going on. And then I found Bob Doppelt's book and the report that you drafted was one of the most staggering pieces of my study. And so I've really been looking for people with something to say about what I call the sober data. And I consider you, if I'm remembering right, you're on the board for the TRIG group, the Transformational Resilience Group?
Yes, the International ITRC, yes I am.
Yeah. So could you say just a little bit about what is the nature of that group, that association? What kind of efforts are being put out there?
Well, there are a number now, I think about 200 people who are mental health professionals and are in related fields. And the goal, Bob Doppelt is himself a person of enormous spiritual connection. And he has put together people who are experts on the issues of creating resilience and finding how to find purpose, how to connect with others, how to find meaning, and in times of enormous stress, how to respond, and for him, how to respond in a way even that shows post-traumatic growth is the way he would describe it. So that's Bob's work is deeply respected, and this is the first time that people have gotten together officially to focus explicitly and uniquely on creating resilience that I know of.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful.
That's how it's being built here in Washington, right? So we're all looking forward to that and seeing. We do see the same cast of characters sometimes. Although I remember saying once to a friend, we will know that we're getting somewhere when we go to events and we don't know so many people.
Yeah.
So we'll see what happens in a couple of weeks here. But I'm looking forward to seeing you.
All right. Thank you. Me too.
Looks like we have a question or comment from Shay. Shay, would you like to jump in?
Yes, I would. Thank you so much, Lise, for being here tonight.
Thank you.
In Carolyn's introduction for you tonight, she just briefly touched on the dark side, the human shadow side of the human psyche. And I was wondering if you might talk about that a little bit and how it comes into play with climate change, not only as maybe a cause, but how do we deal with it to take care of ourselves?
Well, thank you very much for that question. And there are a lot of things to be said about what we could call our dark side. We might also, others might refer to it as our being realistic side. And so the connotation of it being dark is that being immersed in the reality of what we are hearing about certainly is immensely psychologically challenging. And contemplating people being hurt, contemplating nature being so violently abused by our own hand is something that compels us really to look at the darker sides of ourselves. And indeed, some of it's unconscious, some of it's kind of pre-conscious, but however we want to describe it, what we are doing is aggression. And it is something that is a part of our nature, I think, from certainly many, many millions of years of evolution. Aggression was used to protect ourselves, to survive. But now it has been overladen, I think, with what we need to do to get along in a society. But when we are stressed or when push comes to shove, that dark side can really come back to life. And I think that now, at a time when we are asked to be aware of what we're facing and what's happening, that dark sort of selfish side is, and now I'm mixing them. One is the dark sort of selfish aggressive side, but then the other side is acknowledging pain, acknowledging that bad things are going to happen. And so it's a complex, many moving parts part of ourselves that we have to be aware of in order to manage it. I hope that comes close to answering what I think of as a highly complex topic, and one that can both get us into trouble, but can also heighten our awareness of what we're facing.
Thank you.
And I'll just add that there's, I'm not sure that I fully addressed this, but all of us have a side that is problematic for us. And sometimes that problematic side, if we confront it, really yields enormously useful insights. And with those insights, we can sometimes see ahead of other people, and it might even drive us to action when otherwise we might not be as involved and connected and relentless. So those dark sides, those complicated sides can be a very driving force, even though they can be complicated to deal with personally.
Yeah. Thank you so much for that, Lisa. And I'm actually inclined to ask Carolyn if you have anything to say, given just last year you put out Dark Gold, specifically about this topic, both the individual and the collective shadow. And I remember you, I'm sorry, you didn't memorize the darn book, but I do remember a number of times when you really underscored that the shadow is not something to be ashamed of or something to be rejected out of life or something that's wrong with us, but that there is actually gold, that there are actually very human and very important parts of ourselves that are not being expressed in a good, clear, straight way. And I think that's what I was hearing you just say, Lisa. So I'm wondering, Carolyn, if you have anything to add to that.
Sure. It gives me an opportunity to talk about my new book with Andrew Harvey called Return to Joy. And one of the things we talk about in that book is that in order to really experience joy, we have to deal with the shadow. We're a happiness-obsessed culture, let's all be happy. And happiness is circumstantial, and it's all about consumerism, and this makes me happy, this new toy, this new boyfriend, this new job. And whether we're suffering or whether we're not suffering, we can access a deep joy within ourselves. But we have to, the price we pay for that is, that the price of admission to that place is dealing with the shadow, and everybody has one. And it's tough work. It's not easy. And I think that really looking at the climate square on as we are looking at it tonight, as Lisa has been talking about with us, is a beautiful opportunity to dive into shadow work. And we need each other in order to do that. We have to have a safe and supportive place to do that in our lives. And the gold that comes from that, which is why I chose the title Dark Gold. Mm-hmm. The gold that comes from that is amazing, priceless, well worth the time and trouble and energy it takes to do the shadow work.
All right. Thank you so much.
Lisa, we're absolutely on the same page.
So I noticed that we have a question from Terry Chapman. Terry, are you ready to roll that question?
Yeah, thank you. I really appreciate the conversation this evening. It occurs to me that I think that I'm kind of past a bit of a threshold of trying to approach this from a frontal kind of approach and trying to convince people that we are in for a lot of challenges. I think it was Emily Dickinson that said, approach the truth, but on a slant, success and circuit lies. And I'm feeling that where I'm at is like more of a subversive approach. I think people, I want to be there for people, helping to shape a container when there's no longer going to be much delay in people coming to terms with life as it unfolds and unravels. And so to kind of create a space almost subversively or compassionately without trying to convince people that we're really in for the shitstorm that we're in for. And Lisa, I don't know if you have any comments about that kind of approaching it from a slant.
I do have a lot of thoughts about that. And I think that every day, most days anyway, I think I shuffle through a whole number of different tactics. The full-on 2x4, where I say, well, it's baked in, we're getting 10 feet no matter what. And, people will have water sloshing through the living room, and then they'll believe it. And then a few minutes later, I will tell myself that that's not going to work. And I hear myself talking about slogans that we can come up with, never needing to mention climate, and point out that for those people who are unwilling to confront the truth themselves specifically, that approaching them obliquely, not bringing up the climate issues, but simply taking advantage of the fact that we're basically copycats. And social norms is what's going to do it. So we, just as we don't drink and drive, we buckle up, etc. I have no doubt that I believe that if we're really smart, we're going to start coming up with all sorts of social norms that make it unnatural not to be doing the things that we should be doing. No one smokes in public anymore. And just a few short years ago, everybody did. I am quite clear, in my own mind at least, I'm convinced that we are going to be establishing social norms that are on the absolute other end of the spectrum. So depending on the people we're with, I think depending upon our own moods, depending upon what our recent experiences have been with others, all of this goes into the fact that there are multiple messages that are and could be used that are at our disposal, and that it's the judiciousness of the messenger that determines what works best.
Thank you.
In my assessment. So I'm very well understanding your oblique approach, and as well as the sometimes conviction that a 2x4 gets some of your own energy out. But one other thing about messaging that we really know, and that is the best messages and messengers are the people whom we trust, the people whom we like. and having an attitude that we are approaching people in a trusting fashion with warmth, etc., and finding a narrative that is shared is the most effective, even though I do understand why the 2x4 metaphor comes up. I'll let myself, maybe that's my shadow.
Thank you.
You know, Lisa, in the recorded interview, I don't know if you were around to be reminded of it, but soon I will be releasing my first book project, The Impossible Conversation. And I've really been grappling with Terry's question on my own terms, like when is a 2x4 called for? What other tools do we have available? What other tracks are available for the conversation? And the impossible conversation boils down to me to be not at all about the data, about the climate, about the extinction rates, and so on, all these, you know, daunting statistics. What it seemed to boil down to time and time again was that we've disconnected from ourselves, our own core wisdom. We've disconnected from each other, and we've, of course, disconnected from Earth. And so I find myself very able to have conversations with people who are usually call themselves deniers and so on, people who are very different than me. For instance, I'm not a religious person at all, but I've had remarkable, inspiring, warm conversations with people who are deeply religious, because I've had these tracks well worn now in the course of my research. We can find a place to meet when we're talking about things like grace, which has time and time come up for me as I've asked people, what is your experience? When Carolyn just a few minutes ago said it beautifully, when you have the courage to go into those dark places, when we go into and do that hard work inside ourselves, whether it's in religious-based or it's not, there's a payoff more often than not. That payoff tends to be a sense of reconnection with my own heart, reconnection with whatever faith someone might have, of course, a reconnection with the person I'm speaking with, and even for many people, a connection with Earth that they may never have had. So the grace is just this, seems like a blanket of possibility, where if at the start of the conversation, truly it is the impossible conversation, and by the end of this type of conversation, we have an infusion of grace, and it's had almost nothing to do with climate statistics. I don't know if that inspires you to say anything, but I just wanted to put those pieces together.
I'll tell you what, I had a very enlightening experience not long ago. I took the train from Washington to see my brother up in Vermont for his birthday, and obviously I'm trying to keep I try not to fly. And so I left Washington, and Union Station's beautiful, but there's a canyon of concrete and tracks and a tangle of wires and all the rest as you're leaving the train station. And there were some pretty parts in Maryland. We crossed a bridge and over a river, et cetera. But it's mostly more of the same, kind of the backyards of the worst parts of urban decay. And I landed in New York, arrived in New York. And then as I started heading up and farther north, going through Connecticut, and I started seeing more green, and the pine trees started coming out a little by little. I get to Massachusetts, and there are huge fields of solar panels, and it's getting greener. And then we're getting even more north, and I'm seeing much more water and creeks and big boulders, and we hit Vermont, and it's all green and even no houses. And I finally arrived there, and it's a little wooden shack that is the train station. And that's the train that leaves, that's the train that brings me back to Washington, D.C. And I could see the transition and the excitement in me as I was leaving here and making my way up north back to nature. And it reminds me of what some of the challenges are. When we are in some atmospheres or some arenas, it's easier to connect with nature and revel in it and be so grateful for the masterpiece that we are have the amazing opportunity to be a part of. And then you get back down to a place like Washington, D.C., and I hear myself, you're talking, Grace, I'm talking 2x4, and I'm thinking, what's wrong with me? But I realize that when you're in a place like Washington, D.C., where they're making or not making the sausage, however you want to look at it, and you recognize that people are on the dole to say no to what we know is destroying us, that is a pretty tough place to be, and it is going to bring out anger. And a lot of us down here do have our fists in the air, and we want to contemplate grace and beauty and the masterpiece that is nature, but we really have to make a very conscious effort to do that. You're bringing it up and you're reinforcing for me what the transition and what the places are that are necessary for psychological health.
Given that so much, Lisa, of the environments that people deal with on a day-to-day basis do not lend themselves to easily engaging with that nourishment of nature, what kind of recommendations might you make for individuals for whom it is quite difficult to get out of the confines of their daily life?
What a fabulous question. And I have to tell you, I see this every single day. I have people coming into my office, and I said this earlier, but day after day, talking about the fact that they have trouble concentrating and they think they have attention deficit disorder. They're sitting in windowless offices with no light, their circadian rhythms completely turned upside down, spending almost unlimited time in front of a screen. And so it is creating enormous psychopathology. And so what I tell them is that they're not necessarily going to like what I have to say, and I usually fudge a little bit, give them a little bit of the ADD medicine so that they will at least come back and we can engage in a conversation. But I talk to them about the fact that we have left our evolutionary roots. We were not meant to be in these concrete places not seeing green. I bring up the notion of Shinrin-yoku, the Japanese, it's called forest bathing. And we start to talk about what it would mean and what it does mean to see green. It lowers your blood pressure, lowers your breathing rate, your cardiac rate, your adrenaline, the cortisol, which is your stress hormone. And I tell them, we have some fundamental choices here. We can either try to attempt a chemical suppression of what's going on, or you can do the following. And we are lucky in Washington. We do have the C&O Canal. It's a beautiful place, just minutes outside of Washington. And it is a canal with water in it, lots of trees, dogs sometimes, people walking along it. There is even a moonlight walk that's offered, full moonlight walk every month. I talk to them about that. I talk to them about turning off their screens and getting natural light and looking at trying to go to sleep. Of course, we're not doing that right now, but that's in keeping with the way we were evolved, when the sun goes down, when the sun comes up, and reminding them of our evolutionary roots and the fact that seeing green, taking a walk wherever they can, looking at nature, and recognizing that that is where the harmony comes, is something that they have to put a great effort into making happen. We can do it, but it is a change from what the rest of the people around us are doing. So it's a little bit of a kind of a half lecture, half presentation as a choice to stay in the concrete canyon or return to our roots and the harmony that we get from it.
I'd like to just add that I do a lot of life coaching with people and do similar kind of have similar kinds of conversations. And one of the things I find is that we're so disconnected from nature that sometimes people have to be coached in how to be in it. Because you say, take a walk, and they'll think, oh, with my phone? Oh, with something in my ears? Oh, what am I supposed to look for? What's my assignment? What am I supposed to do? And so to teach people how, sad, but we have to teach people sometimes how to just be in nature and commune with it, because we're also cut off from it.
Terribly. You're so right.
And Lisa, there are so many individuals who have virtually closed down they see the devastation, they see the the supreme devastation, and they feel like there's nowhere to go. Their hearts are just full of just disgust and hatred for what's happening in the world. So for somebody who feels like there's no more room inside themselves for anything good, what would you say to those individuals?
Well, this is obviously a very, very sobering reality. And I will admit that today I was doing something for the California Department of Health. And one of the guests, and I was on my phone and I didn't catch all of it, but I believe he was talking about people who are, because of what they believe is coming, they talk to each other about ending their lives. And boy, that was a painful thing to hear. So for people who have lost hope, it takes a little bit of time, and as Carolyn is saying, coaching, and that is that there is so much sensitivity in people like that, and they need to realize that they are the very people who probably have the greatest capacity to speak with others and to turn them around if they can find the strength within them. And where do they find that strength? Obviously, I am a proponent of talking to people who know how to coach you, but I also believe that, as we just said, that going from a place where it's people on phones and a tangle of wires and concrete, and restoring ourselves in nature. And for people who have lost hope, I really, and this is of course easy to say, but because how do you get them there? But I do believe that seeing a sunrise and seeing nature and in its full glory can be transformative, and capturing the energy of the beauty and the masterpiece that is nature is what enables people to turn around and say, all right, we're going to be part of a group that's going to build an urban garden and make sure that everybody has fresh vegetables, or we're going to plant trees, or we're going to clean up a river, or we're going to do something. But this is where making us realize how important it is to be together and form teams to do these things. And this is what Bob Doppel talks about, is creating resilience groups in every community. And that is going to be something that's essential. So it's a very long-winded journey through all these thoughts, but I hope it is helpful.
Thank you so much, Lisa. Shay, I believe you have another question. And would you unmute yourself, please? Thank you.
Thank you. Lise partially answered it, and someone just made a comment too. I personally have a really hard time giving up hope. Now, I think that given everything that we're faced, and Max mentioned an awful lot of things in his comments, it's not just climate change, it's global economic collapse. We're practically on the brink of World War III. Genetic problems, GMO problems, all of these things lead to what's probably an unhappy ending for all beings on the planet, as well as for maybe the planet itself. But still, I can't give up hope. Instead, I found that I'm starting to reframe it. As someone commented, I just saw a tail end of it. I didn't see who made it. It's a matter of reframing it to for me to think about what I really want to hope for now. And for me, it's more, what is my attitude and perspective? What do I want to bring to the planet as we go through all of this to help make things as easy as possible for other beings, and how I might personally end this life. So does Lise have any comments about that?
Yes, I do. And I well understand that people do feel hopeless. And I hear numbers and I hear what climate scientists say. And there is a disbelief sometimes. I have to acknowledge that. even as I'm saying one thing, there's a part of me that insists that it just can't be so because it's too different from the world as I've known it. And I do know that some of my sadness and some of my hopelessness does come out sometimes as anger. And I am, I suppose, lucky in the sense that if I'm in Washington, there are plenty of places to express it in person. So we fight with the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. We interrupt their meetings because they're rubber stamping pipelines and things like that. But in other places, what can we do? There are, depending upon our personality and our temperament type and where we are, there are, and I have always felt that taking action is very empowering, and it's the antidote to hopelessness for me. And I recognize that there are a number of groups like Citizens Climate Lobby. There are people who are involved in politics. There are people involved in cleaning things up and planting and all of these activities that we've mentioned. And that is a place where I feel that we can work through our sense of hopelessness best, because we're with kindred spirits who understand what we're going through. They're not going to argue with us about it. They understand, and they're out there putting one foot in front of the other, even though the numbers are very, very challenging to them too. But I do find this is a rare group of people that I'm talking to right now. This is, I don't know if you understand. Most of the people that I talk to around here, they don't talk about the psychological effects of being activists and what they're doing. They're like this, and they'll say, oh, you're the only one who brings this up. So we're a different group of people on together here tonight that are following Carolyn, Dean, and all the others.
So I put out an invitation to everybody on chat. And we got a little bit of that last session in our first session of the symposium a few days ago. I'd like to do that again and invite each of us that's willing to do so to come on screen for just a few moments. I don't think we have time to have anyone have a tremendously long check-in, but I think it would be so valuable to have as many as would be willing tonight share with us what's in your heart now. Just check in with us. Let us know how you're doing. And also say a few words, if you will, about how do you keep your heart open? How do you stay connected in your world? Is there anyone who'd like to begin?
I'll begin.
Please.
Yeah. I'm Terry here in New Jersey. There's something that is called a window of tolerance, where if you have like two parallel lines, moods can go up and down in oscillation between those. And I find myself like every day feeling highs and lows, but not extreme, and not extreme moments of euphoria or creativity, and nor am I experiencing deep depression, but a lot of swings in mood. And I really appreciate the invitation to get out in nature. I'm going to go backpacking for 4 days next week. And I find myself wanting to get out more and more in the woods and just talk to the trees and to the creek and, just feel that connection. It's good medicine for me. Thank you so much for the community.
Oh, I see.
Do you know how to do
it's
that?
A line, it's a cue.
Well, I turned this on.
Thank you, Carrie.
I'd like to say something. This is Mary. Can you hear me?
Yes, please, Mary.
We've talked about what we see as the negative. We've talked about the data, the details, the numbers, the loss, the devastation. And then we talked about what we can do, and whether or not what we do is going to make a huge difference. But we see atrocities everywhere. We see the declining everywhere. And what it brought to me at that moment was a quote from Derek that we listened to, Derek, last week. It was a lovely interview and questions and answers. but I've had this on my refrigerator door for a long time, and I look at it several times a day. Derek says, if we wish to stop the atrocities, we need merely to step away from the isolation. I hear that in your going out and walking into nature, the various ways to disengage ourselves from what we're so immersed in day by day. If we wish to stop the atrocities, we need merely to step away from the isolation. There's a whole world waiting for us, ready to welcome us home. And every time I see it and read it and I say it to myself or out loud, I feel like that's a place that I am right now and a place I need to be.
That's just beautiful, Mary. Thank you so much. And I guess if I could just check in for a moment, the more personal side of what I mentioned earlier, this infusion of grace that happens in so many of the conversations I have, I got to tell you, for being a non-religious person, in fact, I've had a very aggressive and not good relationship with religion in my life. And in the past year, I can't count how many wonderful, warm, inspiring, connected conversations I've had with people of faith, because I've really given myself the challenge to reach out to people who are not like me and ask them what's important in their world. And I just followed the lead of Catherine Hayhoe, who's a climate scientist and a evangelical Christian. And it's just paid off in spades. And the number of times when I've had dewy eyes looking over at someone else very different than me with dewy eyes, and we haven't talked a lick about the data of collapse or climate change, but we both know something's wrong. And we want to bring our best to that, to each other, to the people who are dear to us. So Mary, you just somehow touched that same spot for me. And thank you so much for saying what you said. Is there someone else, perhaps Beth, were you wanting to share?
Sure. Yeah, sure. What'd you ask? I'm trying to remember the way you asked it. What'd you ask?
Well, I was asking, what's on your heart? How's your heart doing? And if you would like to follow that up with anything that you do to keep your heart open in these times, in these challenges, and how are you doing with being connected in your world, with yourself, with other people, and with the earth?
Well, it is work. It is the work of the rest of my life from now on for sure. I have come to accept all the emotions that the full range of emotions. When I feel something that is uncomfortable or deeply painful, I have learned to let it be because it goes through. I have taught myself that it goes through, and that's very helpful. I allow all the feelings, and I do take action, and then so I recently was introduced to Paul Chafurka, and he has a wonderful essay on his website, and he talks about wherever you are on this ladder of awareness, you will be typically choosing an inner path or an outer path or both. And I definitely participate in both. I spend a lot of time in meditation and in nature. I'm very fortunate because my work with people, I'm a body worker. And so when I touch people, I go in for an hour at a time, every 4 times a day, an hour at a time. I'm in prayer, working with people, touching their bodies, being with them. It's a form of prayer for me. So I'm very lucky. I've got a very strong inner life. And then Kevin and I have invited, well, there's this young couple that comes. They've come 3 times now. We've had 1 other person come. We've got 4 other people interested come to talk about these things. And boy, I think we scared them last time. So I'm hoping they will come back. But there's action, trying to create a community, a small community, even if it is just these 2 other people, to talk about these things. And then I had this brainstorm this weekend. I said, okay, here's what I want to do. I want to do a survey. And so I'll randomly choose the number 350. I'm going to approach 350 people, and I'm going to ask them on a scale of 1 to 10, what level of concern do you have about climate change and what we're going through? And I started it right away. I started it with the fella at the checking me out at Trader Joe's, and I asked him on a scale of 1 to 10, where are you in terms of concerns about this? And he said, oh, we're done. We're so far beyond it. And it was fascinating to me to have spoken to a stranger and had that real response and a real reaction. It was fascinating. Now, I've decided of the next 349 people, I want to put them in age brackets. I think it would be interesting to look at where they are. He was probably in his 20s. Oh my, and my heart goes out to those people and to these children coming up. I have a friend who's got a 5-year-old, and I've got another friend who's got a 2-year-old. Wow. You know, what a world. Anyway, living with all the feelings. Thank you for asking.
Okay, thank you so much. I just put out another invitation for anyone else who would like to do this sort of impromptu check-in that we're doing. Lisa, how you doing? Is there anything that's been...
I was going to say, this is so, what's the right word I'm looking for? So insightful of you to ask this question and to ask it in the way that you did. It gives people such a sense of being connected to each other, and the way you said it makes people feel, when you said what's in your heart, it is such a profound, really, means to encourage people to feel safe with their deepest fears. And boy, you know, that's something I know professionally we strive for all the time. And this is the place where people can find comfort and solace and can steady themselves. And the way I'm hearing people talk here tonight, this is something that this group is uniquely, I think, experiencing. And I say uniquely, there are others, yes. But as I say, many of the people that I work with are very disconnected from what's in their heart. Mm-hmm. Their head, and they want action, but they are not thinking about what they're feeling, and they're not bringing people in with them.
Yeah. Yeah. Is there anyone else that's willing to step up and tell us a little bit about how you're doing?
Dean, can you hear me? This is Phil in Ashland.
Hi, Phil in Ashland, please.
Hi. Well, it's taken me a little bit to get the courage to speak, but my wife and I have been climate refugees for a little over a year now since the big forest fires hit on the West Coast. We've been out of our home. We've lived in close to 20 different places since last August 1st. And moving that many times, losing all your possessions, clothes, having papers covered in ash, I have really experienced what it's like to be a homeless person, which I've never been before. And it took months to consider that I'm experiencing much of what a homeless person is. We have our income still, but all of our worldly possessions, our history, are covered in oily ash. And what I wish people would do to us about, it's been really something to talk to old friends and family members about. Maybe a third of the time, often with people who we don't even know that well, we'll give compassionate responses and offers of help. But most people go into denial. They give advice. Why don't you just go in and vacuum your house? Why don't you go in and paint? Why don't you sell your house? There's a lot of people who can't smell smoke. And of course, the official ones, State Farm Insurance and our insurance agent, all their, well, it's a housekeeping problem, or nobody else had that problem, over and over. So on the official legal level, where State Farm's new tagline is, "So sue me," which is happening from Katrina, disasters all over the country. What I think people need to know is that there are thousands of people who are refugees in this country and elsewhere. That's right. And the approach ought to be acknowledge that that's going on, and not saying, oh, it's because you lost your job, or you sold your house and decided to move north. We were in Vancouver Island for a couple of months in the summer to escape this season's smoke. And they were facing huge immigration from China. And the underlying thing we heard a good bit was the cities are unlivable. You can't see through, you can't breathe, you wear masks. That's climate change. And they're migrating in the millions, and yet it's not identified as climate change. So we're going to have to deal with the refugee problem. Europe is a climate refugee problem.
Phil, may I ask you, how do you keep yourself connected? How do you keep your heart as open as I experience your heart to be? How do you do it?
It took me about half an hour of listening to build up the courage to speak at all. Some meditation, some depression, some anger, some hearing about people turning the valves off on the tar sands oil coming into this country and getting arrested. That's inspiring. Mm-hmm. Hearing about blocking off the pipeline in North Dakota, that's inspiring. Mm-hmm. People taking action. It's hard enough when you're a refugee to just find the next place to live and to find the damn paper so you can finish your taxes. But like I did yesterday on extension, I had to make stuff up because I don't know where those documents are. Yeah. So it's our action. My action is to speak the truth sometimes when I have the energy.
Yeah.
Can't all the time.
Thank you so much for that. Thank you so much for that.
Thank you.
May I say something?
Please.
Well, yeah. I just feel so actually rewarded by the fact that, Philip, you felt like talking, and that this is an atmosphere in which all of us can be ourselves. So I'm feeling a great deal of gratitude for the comfort of knowing that that was the feeling that was established here.
Do we have other people that would like to use these last few minutes to let us know how you are?
Yeah, I will.
Hi, Caroline.
Yeah, hi, Dean. Hi, everyone. I just like to say I think I find it in my breathing and in the sense of consciously opening my heart. I know we all work at that all the time, but as a person who's been thinking about this already for quite a number of years, I feel that it's my task at hand to help people that are new to it. I am finding in the last 6 months, and even in the last 3 months, more and more people that are opening to these ideas for the first time in their life. And they're possibly unlikely people on the surface. And it's just conversations are opening. And if I can be there to help them, and we were talking earlier about suggesting and reminding people to go out into nature. I'm very fortunate. I do that a lot. But I think another thing that I try and keep in mind is to suggest to people that maybe do not have that opportunity for various reasons, physical or work or whatever, that create a vision of nature within your mind. Remember once being in a garden with a bird and try and get there with that spot. And I think that's really important because a lot of people physically can't get out into nature. So I think that's helpful from my experience.
Thank you so much. So good to see you. I'm so glad you're joining us for this.
Yes.
Thank you, Carolyn.
Yeah.
Is there anybody else?
Well, Dean, actually, if I may,
Please.
I'd like to hook something that Caroline just said to something that Phil said. You know, when you can't get out there yourself to be in nature, and you can create it in your mind, okay. But going back to what Phil said about being a refugee, a climate refugee within this country, and the impact that that's had on him, and how unlikely people have shown support and compassion to he and his partner. If we can't go out physically and take action on something that's important and means something to us, we can support the people who are doing that. And this builds a web of connection and support. I'll just give you a for instance. The Dakota Pipeline. Very few people can go physically be there and lay their bodies down in front of those bulldozers. But if you have a heart to supporting that kind of action, you can send food, you can send medical supplies, you can light a candle and actively, energetically support. You can organize a gather needed items event together in your community. That's just an example of the kind of support that one can give from their armchair for climate refugees, for homeless for whatever reason, for fill in the blank. And I think this ties back to something that Lisa brought up a couple of times about action. Taking some action, that is the antidote to that despair over the current conditions. So that's my little 2 cents worth there. And anybody else in the group tonight, we only have a few minutes left, and it would be lovely to hear from any of you that would like to step up.
While we're waiting for any last minute sharing, I'd like to repeat something I think we've said at least a little in last session, and we'll keep mentioning it every time in the 8 or 9 sessions that we have in this symposium. we're clear that we're done offering standalone symposia. That when it ends, and that everybody has to figure it out and go off in their separate directions. When clearly what the calling is for is community, is some way to get together, some way to find our people. And for some lucky people, that'll mean people who are neighbors or right down the street or in the same town. And for many of us, it'll mean like this. We've got an electronic temporary village going on right here. And I feel as warm and connected with right now with all of you, no matter where you're from. It's miraculous to me. So a brief reminder that we're planning on offering after the ending of the symposium every other week on a particular day and time each week, same day, same time, every other week. We're going to be offering at no cost just an opportunity like this, a Zoom call, a video call, where people like yourselves who have experienced this kind of thing can come and we can see each other and share with each other. And then we're hoping also that you would bring your friends, bring people that you just want to include in this kind of space, this kind of environment, a safe container for this kind of sharing, that they may never have heard of any of this before. They'll be as welcome as anyone. So I want you to know that that's previews of coming attractions. We're going to be doing that. You're certainly welcome. Your friends are welcome, your family, whatever you'd like to include. We're also starting to formulate other things. And we'd love to hear what you see is needed, what you see would be useful for you as you formulate. Is there a usefulness to have a subgroup that's interested in being activists or supporting activism? For some people, that is, like Phil was saying, that's electrifying, that's energizing. For others, it's not their thing. I have a tremendous interest in exploring and getting more and more facility with this, the notion of shadow, our individual and collective shadow, and how to grapple with that in my own process and how to be with others who are dear to me as they grapple with their shadow, and so on and so on. So what I'd like to ask each of you to do is, between now and next session, and certainly any of the sessions we meet, to bring ideas that are important to you. What would be useful to share with other people of kindred spirits who perhaps there's a subgroup, perhaps there's a focus group that would be important or good for you to invite others to. Maybe there's someone who's inspired enough to get on Facebook and create a private Facebook group for this group, and we can see how that goes. You get the idea. I don't want to spend too much more time trying to generate all the ideas. We just want to invite you all to bring what you're seeing is needed or ideas you might have, so that by the end of this thing, we've got a handful of really strong ways to stay connected, if that's what we're wanting to do.
I think that's a really brilliant idea. And I do know some people who have confided in me that they are very eager to talk with others and to be able to gather. The only thing that I'm thinking is that is there some way that you can present a name so that people can think of this not as, but they can think of it as a place where they can go versus just going online to connect. Yeah. But if there's some name that you can give that is welcoming and feels inclusive, that this is perhaps going to seem more concrete.
Yeah, we have that, and we are in formulation. Particularly Carolyn and I are brewing as we speak with the structures that will range from this kind of symposium and also live events, the kind of grief rituals and so on, and also a tremendous number of offerings of online video on demand learning opportunities. And all of these will definitely have a name. And we will be announcing that stuff before the end of the symposium. So you're right on track with us.
But by the way, I've belonged to a group called Solastalgia that has formulated in West Virginia. And I'm going to invite them certainly to get in touch with you, because they are people who have seen their states just laid waste by huge coal companies.
Yeah.
And they're fighting back now, and they're talking about health impacts. But the grief that they have is tangible, and I believe that they would be a real natural place, at least, to look at collaborating.
Please feel free to share my email address with them, and I'm happy to send you that, my contact information, and I'm pretty sure Carolyn would be the same.
Absolutely, so. Please do.
Yeah. Do we have any last minute sharings? We have someone who's asking for some spellings of
yes,
some of the names.
I think I gave her some.
Oh, okay.
In the chat.
So Catherine Hayho, which has H-A-H-O-E, and then Bob Doppelt, D-O-P-P-E-L-T, and Per, P-E-R, Espen Stoknes, S-T-O-K-N-E-S, and you can find him on Amazon. You know, I just want to say, if I may grab a minute here, one more time, I am astounded at how close and warm and connected I feel in this electronic environment. It blows my mind. I just never would have guessed that there was closeness available at this level. And as a number of people have said tonight, it's because each of us is bringing our heart to this experience. And it doesn't matter that it's via electrons instead of being in the same room. So thank you, each of you, so much for bringing your hearts. It's exactly what I had in mind in putting this symposium together. And Carolyn, I guess I'll just hand it off to you to close up the evening if you'd like.
Well, I don't have much else to add, except I really want to thank Lisa for being with us. You've been very generous with your time. Thank you so much for the work you're doing in the world in so many areas. And thank you all for being with us. I am deeply moved and warmed by the presence of all of you, and I'm very excited about what we can all create together going forward. So thank you all so much.
All right. Thank you. Good night.
Good night.
Good night.
Thanks for watching another episode of the Poetry of Predicament podcast, produced by Dean Walker and the Living Resilience Alliance, www.livingresilience.net. Music today from Michael Hedges, as always, and also Port Blue Into the Sea. You may want to check out our sister podcasts, the new Lifeboat Hour with Carolyn Baker on Podbean and at carolynbaker.net. Also, the Impossible Conversation podcast, another channel on YouTube. Thanks so much for joining us. Join us again later for another episode of the Poetry of Predicament.